Contemporary understanding of the civil rights movement is based on a myth of peaceful protest that falsely dichotomizes between law-abiding protesters and violent, lawless looters. Many people seem to believe that the civil rights movement aimed to change the hearts and minds of racist oppressors through love and nonviolent protest. That is a whitewashing. The civil rights movement worked through breaking unjust laws to provoke violence from oppressors in order to shame liberal federal politicians to intervene in the South, or to disrupt the social order to the point that it could not function absent justice. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would write in his letter from a Birmingham jail, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. Within the context of the New Deal, which had already been securing rights and protections for workers, it was possible to imagine using expanding government power to secure rights, protections, and prosperity for black people. Nevertheless, civil rights progressed fitfully because it was hard to maintain public support in the interests of moderates who wanted activists to patiently wait for justice. But activists declared the fierce urgency of now. For 100 years, moderates told black folk to wait for the rights guaranteed to them by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So activists escalated. When the press ignored protests, civil rights organizations intentionally instigated greater violence. And civil rights was about more than just ending the legal system of segregation called Jim Crow. The ultimate goal was real and substantial freedom, which would require, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., special compensatory measures for blacks. King would write, "A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro." The economic vision of the civil rights movement has largely been forgotten in attempts to make civil rights a story about national progress and unity, and to make figures like MLK into nonpartisan heroes. But we should remember that the civil rights movement was controversial in its time because it demanded systemic changes over incrementalism and performative politics. Starting in the 1890s, Southern cities and states passed laws that created a white supremacist caste system. This caste system dictated that blacks and whites go to separate schools and use separate facilities. Total separation was impossible since blacks performed much of the domestic work in Southern households. But racial interactions always had to occur in the context of white dominance and black subordination. A black person, in other words, could go to the white part of town, but only if they were working as a servant to a white person. On buses and trains, blacks had to sit in the back, and if there was insufficient seating for all the white passengers, the black passengers would have to stand. Central to segregation was endogamy, the marrying within your own race. It was against the law for whites and blacks to romantically or sexually relate with each other. Even showing a hint of interest in a white woman could result in a lynching, which was very common in the South. Now, there was segregation in housing, education, and jobs in the North. Many houses in northern cities had racial covenants which restricted resale to white folk, and in jobs, blacks were the last to be hired and the first to be fired, and were relegated to the lowest paid and most dangerous jobs. But civil rights activism focused on the South because legal segregation was most systemic there, and it was where most black people lived. In the 1930s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, or the NAACP, turned to ending legal discrimination in education. The 14th Amendment mandates that states shall provide every person equal protection under the law. Segregation would seem to violate the 14th Amendment, but states circumvented the Constitution by asserting that blacks and whites could be legally segregated as long as their separate facilities were equal. The Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of separate but equal in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, where Justice Henry Brown wrote that to assume the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. In reality, facilities for blacks were always inferior, but whites claimed that inferior facilities resulted from blacks paying less in property taxes, not due to any official discrimination. In the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case, the NAACP argued that the doctrine of separate but equal in education was inherently unequal, no matter the quality of the facilities, because telling black children they could not attend the same schools as white children was psychologically damaging. They substantiated this argument with social science studies which had found that black children favored white dolls over black dolls. The Supreme Court, which at this time consisted of mostly Roosevelt and Truman appointees, agreed and unanimously ruled against segregated schools. In response, nearly every Southern senator and congressman signed the Southern Manifesto, which declared that the court wrongly decided Brown, and that they would oppose this decision by all legal means. Southern businessmen formed white councils to blacklist any African American who participated in civil rights organizations or who tried to send their kids to white schools. Some Southern districts minimally attempted to comply with the Brown decision, which led to a massive confrontation in Arkansas in 1957 after 9 black students tried to desegregate Little Rock High School. When Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus withdrew the National Guard, which was protecting the Little Rock Nine from white mobs, President Dwight Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Infantry Division to enforce the court orders. Now, Eisenhower believed civil rights was a political rather than moral issue, and he equated civil rights activists with the Ku Klux Klan. But he was a military man who could not abide defiance of a court order. Furthermore, he feared that the conflict in Little Rock besmirched the United States in comparison to the Soviet Union, who they were competing with for the loyalty of millions of brown and black folk around the world, forming new nations in the wake of disintegrating European empires. The Soviet Union broadcasted hundreds of hours of shows and distributed thousands of pamphlets pointing to the treatment of the Little Rock Nine as proof that the United States was another racist imperialist country that treated colored people poorly.
Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation.
But in general, the public was indifferent to civil rights. So to break through public indifference, civil rights activists turned to nonviolent resistance after 1954. The idea of nonviolent resistance comes from 19th century American philosopher Henry David Thoreau. In a pamphlet called Resistance to Civil Government, better known as Civil Disobedience, he argued that you should refuse to obey any law which violates your conscience, and willingly pay the price for that disobedience. He refused to pay his taxes to protest the United States waging an unjust war against Mexico from 1846 to 1848. Civil disobedience influenced the Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi, who developed the concept for mass resistance. Gandhi argued that a nonviolent resistor should confront the oppressor with the injustice of his own actions by disobeying a law publicly, thereby forcing the government to beat or punish him in some way. That willingness to suffer gives the resistor the moral and spiritual high ground. This works most effectively when a regime is hypocritical, when there is a gap between their stated ideals and their actions. The British Empire claimed to be bringing liberty, democracy, and political equality to its colonies, but in reality, it exploited its colonies and propped up oppressive elites, and Gandhi sought to shame them for that. Gandhi's actions inspired American activists who wanted to use nonviolent resistance to shame Northern politicians and voters into doing something about civil rights. Though the Northern public ostensibly opposed Jim Crow, they considered it an issue of Southern culture, and Northern liberals believed economic growth would dispel racism and bigotry. Activists wanted to create the tension that would make civil rights unavoidable. This new phase of the civil rights movement began in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The way the story is usually told is that Rosa Parks, a tired seamstress, refused to give up a seat for a white passenger, thus sparking the civil rights movement. It is a story that highlights how individuals acting in accordance to their conscience can change history. But Rosa Parks did not just one day decide that she had had enough. She was a member of the Alabama chapter of the NAACP, which had been planning for some time to challenge Birmingham's segregation laws. And she was chosen as the one to set off this partly because she was a small woman, a mother, and an educated and working person as well. In other words, she was a respectable face for the movement. The NAACP challenged her conviction in the courts, and women activists coordinated a bus boycott. And they chose a 26-year-old preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to be its face because he was an outsider not embroiled in local politics. With other black ministers, King would go on to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. Again, the usual story is that the bus boycott compelled Montgomery politicians to desegregate their buses. In fact, the boycott ended when the courts ruled in favor of Parks, but the boycott and the media attention it garnered concerned other southern cities which feared that open racial strife would chase away federal dollars and northern investment. So some southern cities eliminated discrimination in public transportation. But this wasn't a systemic change that fundamentally altered Jim Crow. 4 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, several college students from A&T University in Greensboro, North Carolina decided to desegregate the lunch counters at the Woolworth's department store. Black and white students sat together at the lunch counters and endured the vitriol and bullying from other white customers. Again, the goal was to generate bad publicity for Southern businesses, the hopes that they would desegregate not only their businesses, but also influence local politicians to change Jim Crow laws. Lunch counter protests spread to dozens of cities, and the students who participated in this protest eventually formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. SNCC illustrates that civil rights was not just a movement of charismatic leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. It took the courage of everyday people, and it was supported by millions of people in the South and in the North who would rather risk their health and safety and freedom than continue to live in a society which legally inscribed inferiority onto blacks. During the summer of 1961, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, worked to compel the federal government to enforce court orders outlawing racial segregation in interstate transportation by organizing freedom rides where volunteers violated these racially discriminating policies. At the Montgomery Greyhound bus station, a white mob badly beat the Freedom Riders. John Lewis was struck over the head with a Coca-Cola crate and left lying in a pool of his own blood. The Freedom Riders fled to the First Baptist Church, which a mob of 3,000 whites surrounded. This created a tense situation for President John Kennedy, who, like Eisenhower, considered civil rights a secondary issue. But as with Eisenhower, the turmoil in Alabama embarrassed the United States. So Kennedy sent marshals to guard the folks at First Baptist Church. The freedom rides continued afterwards, but the governor of Alabama protected the riders with police escorts until they left the state. This defeated the purpose of the freedom rides, which is to provoke confrontation. Moreover, Northern public sympathy waned. A May Gallup poll found that 61% of the public disapproved of the rides. The New York Times editorial board wrote that the riders were challenging not only long-held customs, but passionately held feeling. And furthermore, nonviolence that deliberately provokes violence is a logical contradiction. By 1963, the Northern media was ignoring the civil rights movement as Southern leaders learned to quietly arrest protesters. So the SCLC targeted Birmingham, Alabama, which had a brutish, impulsive police commissioner, Bull Connor.
Got to keep the white and the black separate.
Initially, Bull Connor showed surprising restraint by quietly rounding up protesters and busing them to jails. Running out of adult marchers, Martin Luther King Jr. turned to children, 6 years of age and older, which was the age at which children could decide whether or not to follow Christ. King reasoned that if a child was old enough to make a decision about his eternal soul, he was old enough to make a decision about whether he wanted to participate in civil rights. With the jails filling up, Bull Connor unleashed water cannons and German shepherds on the child marchers, which was captured on film and camera. The media wrote more articles about civil rights in the weeks after the Children's March than in the previous year. Mass demonstrations broke out over the country, which moved John Kennedy, who on June 3, 1963, announced his intention to introduce a civil rights bill.
100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it.
Before he could sign a Civil Rights Act, Kennedy was assassinated. This seemed bad for the civil rights movement because his vice president was a Southerner, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had watered down previous civil rights legislation. However, as president, Johnson was free from Texas politics, and he used his enormous political skills to shepherd the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. This act bars discrimination in hiring, education, and in public accommodations on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out to President Johnson that without voting rights, black people lacked the means to secure their civil rights. Southern states had made it difficult for blacks to vote through means such as absurdly difficult literacy tests, like having to recite the entire state constitution, while giving much easier tests to white voters. Across the South, only about 30% of African Americans were registered to vote in 1964. In Alabama, the black registration rate was less than 10%. Nothing in the Civil Rights Act would help blacks vote. Originally, a voting rights provision had been proposed for the Civil Rights Act, but Johnson wanted to move on because he feared spending too much political capital on voting rights when his real ambition was an economic program, the Great Society, to surpass the New Deal. So the SCLC launched another massive campaign for voting rights. They targeted Selma, the seat of a county in Alabama where only 156 of 15,000 black adults were registered to vote. The march took place on March 7, 1965. When the marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by the state troopers.
I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. Experience has clearly shown that the existing process of law cannot overcome systematic and ingenuous discrimination. Wednesday, I will send to Congress a law designed to eliminate illegal barriers to the right to vote. But even if we pass this bill, The battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
On August 6, 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. Within 2 decades, black voter registration in the South increased from 31% to 73%. The number of black members of Congress grew from 5 to 44, and by 1975, the number of black elected officials rose from 72 to nearly 1,600. This is because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made the federal government an active player in the process of voter registration. In counties with registration rates of less than 50%, the federal government automatically oversaw voting procedures, held elections, registered black voters, and investigated complaints. Any new voting procedures or laws had to first be approved by the Justice Department in order to go into effect. After 1965, MLK shifted his focus to criticizing the war in Vietnam and eradicating poverty. He planned to lead another march on Washington, much like the one in 1963, but this time for jobs and income now, or join. He envisioned a multiracial movement consisting of white Appalachian coal miners, Mexican-American farm workers, Native Americans, and blacks in the ghettos. But before he could lead this march, he was assassinated on March 4, 1968, at the age of 39. By the end of the 1970s, the legacy of the civil rights movement would be sanitized. Liberals focused on how peaceful protest won over the hearts and minds of racists, while conservatives argue that policies aimed at specifically helping black people violated King's legacy by focusing on skin color rather than the content of character. In this telling, Martin Luther King Jr. is transformed into a conservative neoliberal proponent of colorblind individualistic meritocracy who only wanted a chance for black persons to be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. This obscures the democratic socialist views of MLK, who said that poverty was one of the 3 great evils of the United States, and that it was absurd to believe that blacks could compete equally with whites after centuries of oppression. So what are some of the lessons that we can draw from the civil rights movement? First, protests and marches are not likely to be effective if they are not disruptive. In the Jim Crow South, simply gathering in public spaces was enough to disrupt a social order based on blacks only being in white spaces as subservience. In our times, however, simply marching rarely has any effect, as evidenced by the massive but mostly ineffective Iraq War protests, and in fact is more likely to legitimize the current system by parading the freedom to publicly protest that system. So modern protest has to deploy different methods to disrupt. That could be sit-down strikes in businesses, marching in and shutting down highways and important arteries of commerce, or even interrupting city and state legislative meetings. Second, protests must be prolonged, unpredictable, and multidimensional. Public and media interest is fickle. Politicians are adaptable and understand how to diffuse tension and deflect attention. So pressure must be continuously applied, and the tactics continuously changed to sustain focus. Third, politicians will try to pass half measures, or co-opt radical energy for incremental changes. Protesters must persist in their demands and not allow politicians or the media to shift the goalposts, create scapegoats, or try to assuage discontent with calls for patience. Finally, addressing mere legal forms of discrimination without addressing systems which reinforce social, economic, and political inequality are bound to disappoint.
Black people are economically insecure. White liberals are economically secure. Can you begin to build an economic coalition? Are the liberals willing to share their salaries with the economically insecure black people they so much love? Then if you're not, are you willing to start building new institutions that will provide economic security for black people? That's the question we want to deal with.
The purpose of the civil rights movement was to provide blacks the full blessings of American life. But despite the elimination of legal forms of discrimination and the enormous gains blacks have made with voting, racial inequality and segregation is as bad as it's ever been. The average black family only has 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. Blacks are 6.5 times as likely to be incarcerated for drug use as whites, despite similar rates of usage. Since the 1960s, the prison population has grown about 7-fold, with blacks disproportionately making up that growth. A black person is 3 times more likely to be rejected for a loan than a white person and will be charged much higher interest rates. A house in a black neighborhood will be valued at 23% less than a similar house in a white neighborhood, even if the neighborhood amenities and crime rates are similar. At all education levels, blacks are twice as likely to be unemployed and make significantly less than their white counterparts. They are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by the police than whites, and they live 4 years less on average. Protesters and organizers, therefore, must look beyond individual bad laws and policies and search for root causes. They should also be mindful that forces of the status quo will try to co-opt their movement, and cynics will point to these attempted co-options as evidence that the demands for justice are hollow, corrupt, or lost. But within any movement there will be forces of co-option battling with forces of radicalism. This is not a possibility to be feared, but an inevitability to be prepared for. Organizers will have to wage an inward-facing battle against moderating agents of co-option, as well as an outward-facing battle against the conditions which gave rise to the movement. And even when cynicism is correct, it is usually incomplete and only serves the forces of co-option. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it or found it informative, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. For further readings, check out the description box below.